The Western is the only film genre native to America, rooted in its history and landscape, but it was the first to achieve immense popularity worldwide. Its stories were based on the cowboys who followed the cattle trails, the wars with the Indians, and the struggles to impose law and order on the frontier. From the very earliest silent westerns a century ago, the genre has been based on confrontation. The good guy versus the bad guy, who was finished off in a gunfight in the last reel. Yet the form would become more questioning after the Second World War. More ambivalent about violence, more ambiguous about who the good guys really were.
Just a day, son of a bitch!
In the 60s, the Italians reinvented the genre, creating the spaghetti western. While bandits became heroes and directors tried to tear away the mythology of the West, revealing the brutality and complexity behind the romantic vision of earlier films.
One of the good things about playing westerns, I mean, the reason I like to play westerns was you got to play a really bad guy. You know, really nasty.
To this day, whenever America is threatened or feels itself to be threatened, our politicians will often drop into, I think unconsciously, drop into a kind of Gary Cooper, John Wayne mode.
Of course, if you really investigate how the West was won, it was slaughter. We went in and murdered a lot of people, Indians, and took over the land. I don't know if they really investigated that.
The first Western to achieve renown was the Great Train Robbery of 1903, but many of the traditional Western elements were already present. A robbery by gunmen, a chase on horseback, and a final shootout. Many of these early silent Westerns also drew on the stories of Indian attacks, and the director Thomas Ince even featured a troupe of genuine Indians in his films.
A lot of silent Westerns are about the vanishing American, i.e. the Native American, and there's a lot of films that actually take the side of the Indian, the American Indian. For example, versions of Ramona, which was a novel written in the 1880s. There's various versions of Ramona, the famous song that was reissued in the 60s, which is all about a lament for the decline of a great civilization.
The idea that there is some uniformly dismissive or racist attitude towards the Indian as reflected in Hollywood Westerns is not in and of itself, I think, accurate. There are too many noticeable exceptions. In films like The Vanishing American, it's all about Indians. You know, they are the central character, and they're very sympathetically portrayed. That's 1926. The West was only 30 years ago in these movies. I mean, if you think about it, the West then was like 1970 is to us. It's not a long ways away.
Films like John Ford's The Iron Horse, or James Cruise's The Covered Wagon, or The Big Trail, which are doing a sort of epic story of the journey across America. And a lot of the actual participants are still alive, just. So they actually appear in the movies sometimes. I mean, Wyatt Earp appeared in the movies.
Wyatt Earp was living in Southern California, and all you had to do was ring him up on the phone, and he'd come down and tell you how, you know, men really used guns. It was all right there.
By the 1930s, the Western had chiefly become the province of B-movie directors, using formulaic plots and shooting on low budgets. But the greatest of all Western directors was to revolutionize the genre. John Ford's Stagecoach is regarded by many as the classic Western. Released in 1939, the story of a stagecoach journey through hostile Indian territory was in some ways typical of the early Westerns. The Indians were a faceless, uncharacterized menace, and the film provided the chases and final gunfight expected by its audience. But it also added a more sophisticated portrayal of Western society.
I think it harks back to the silent Westerns in the sense that these people are almost like archetypes, and archetypes that he had dealt with in the silent era, like, you know, the drunk doctor, the timid salesman, the crooked politician, the good bad man, the good bad girl, the society lady, the southern gentleman. All of these are cliche. You could say stereotypes, or you could call them archetypes Ford made them into archetypes if they weren't before.
Society's outcasts are the ones who do the hard work of society, not the bankers, not the presidents, not the people that get their name in the newspapers. It's a whore, it's a drunken doctor, it's a gambler, it's an escaped convict. These are the people who band together. These are the strength of America.
Haven't I any right to live? What have I done?
We're the victims of a foul disease called social prejudice, my child. These dear ladies of the Law and Order League are scouring out the dregs of the town. Come on. Be a proud, glorified dreg like me.
You get going, Doc. You're drunk.
Stagecoach is valuable, aside from its implicit qualities as a movie, in two areas. I think it establishes the mythology of John Wayne. And I think it establishes the mythology of Monument Valley, both almost with a thunderclap.
Well, Duke Wayne was extraordinarily good-looking and very tall, and a real hunk. I mean, 6'4", football player, lean, well-built, good face, good walk, which he'd worked on.
John Wayne had been around since 1930, starring in movies. And Ford set him up so that audiences could see him as if it was the very first time. His introduction, Ford tracks in very rapidly onto John Wayne's face.
Hold it!
Oh, steady, ho.
Now, that's not a typical John Ford camera movement. John Ford did that camera movement very few times in his entire career.
I don't think he thought he could act that much, but he didn't think he was a great actor, but he had a real star quality, which Ford knew exactly how to deal with.
And John Ford was very simple, photographed brilliantly. I mean, his choice of locations was wonderful. You know, I thought, geez, where is that? Monument Valley, the Arches, you know, Moab, all of those beautiful countryside.
Monument Valley had been there for thousands of years. It had even been used tangentially in a film or two, The Vanishing American and The Silent Days, the Zane Grey films. But it had never had the care lavished on it that Ford lavished on it. Ford adored the place. He loved its isolation. He loved its solitude. The impact of Monument Valley in Stagecoach is to just set the context of the Stagecoach being a tiny little dot in this vast lunar expanse that nobody had ever really seen clearly before.
I think that Stagecoach is an example of the romanticizing the West in the sense that the hero is a little bit of a superhero. He's able to do heroic things and perform deeds that are beyond the scope of anybody but a great stuntman like Yakima Canutt.
One major factor in Stagecoach's success was its brilliant action sequences, especially the 10-minute scene in which the stagecoach is chased by Indians. John Ford employed Yakima Canutt, perhaps Hollywood's greatest ever stuntman, whose work in the film became legendary.
Well, he had about the best stuntman. It was Yakima Canutt, and who did that stunt under the stagecoach, which had never been done before. But I think again, Ford was going for a great movie.
I've seen him do it in 2 or 3 different pictures other than Stagecoach. You jump out of the seat, you go down onto the wheelers, the swing, and the lead team, and in some cases he's shot off and he goes under the whole team. If you ever look down between the horses, there's not much room.
He had done similar stunts at Republic, I believe, a couple of years before. It was not the first time that he'd done that trick, but it was the first time anybody had seen it well shot, well framed, well built up to.
Well, the old Westerns, they were all stunts. It was, I think, much more important than the acting. You can remember things you've seen done in some of the old westerns, and you can't even remember who starred in it.
In terms of Stagecoach, he's got an amazing, it's an amazing structural achievement, because after spending 10 minutes with this very exciting race between the Indians and the Stagecoach on the dry lake, he then has another confrontation immediately following. There's John Wayne against three guys. Gunfight is, again, paradigmatic in almost every Western. Shots are going to be fired, people will die. You'd have a hard time, I think, finding 5 Westerns where there's not gunshots fired.
George Stevens' film, Shane, released in 1953, became one of the first Westerns to explore the nature of violence in its tale of a gunfighter forced to help a group of farmers to defeat oppressive ranchers.
Shane is similar to John Ford's films in some ways, dissimilar in others. The emphasis on landscape is certainly something that Stevens was taking from Ford.
I remember going up the first time looking for locations, and people driving out in cars, and Dad would get out and he'd walk and walk and walk. He had a strong concept of the lenses he would use in shooting Shane. And if you notice, the scenes that play in front of the Tetons loom so tall. And it was because he'd set the camera back from the actors and use a 100mm lens and draw the Tetons up.
Stevens was such a painstaking filmmaker. I knew a man who was a front office executive at Paramount when Shane was made. And he said that after 5 days of location shooting, Stevens was 4 days behind schedule, and the front office was going absolutely berserk, because this was their worst nightmare. A painstaking, perfectionist director on location.
Shane, wonderful movie, yeah. Jack Palance was really bad, you know.
Jack Palance was inspired casting, and he was a man who'd never been in the West. And I remember when he came out and arrived, and he had that extraordinary face, and he was rather, almost menacing-looking man, even in real life.
Stevens is taking very classic archetypes. I mean, Jack Palance, this satanic-looking bad guy, dressed completely in black, with a kind of slow, evil grin. And Alan Ladd, this blonde, very beautiful still at that point in his career, much more vulnerable seeming agent of good.
Shane had a very well-structured screenplay. They worked hard on it, and the screenplay was pretty much shot as it was written. And it had a device of Shane coming and being thought to be the protector of these people, and then a couple of the fellas saw him in town when the Ben Johnson character kind of buffaloes him.
Have some of this. Smell like a man.
Ben Johnson was a real Western guy. He was a rodeo rider, a Western person who John Ford brought into the movies. And there's something so authentic about Ben Johnson when he derides and belittles Shane and calls him Sody Pop, setting up a conflict that's going to work throughout the rest of the picture.
Now, you and your soda pop, get out of here and stay out of here.
Shane is a gunfighter. He's a killer. What's a gunfighter do? He kills people. He's fast. He's very fast. He tries to put his guns away, but one damn thing keeps happening after another, and he's got to pull the guns back out because he's got to protect these people because they can't protect themselves. They don't have his professional skill.
You're a low-down lying Yankee. Prove it. No, Dory.
The most famous moment in Shane, non-involving Alan Ladd, is the death of Elisha Cook, where Jack Palance guns him down in cold blood.
He had the crew dig under the muddy water and put a mattress. And this was the first time this was done. He put a leather belt around Elisha Cook Jr. under his clothing and had 2 wires coming from the back of it. And so with the mattress under the mud, they played the scene. And when Palance shot Torrey, there were 2 of the biggest grips on the picture holding this wooden rod attached to the wire, and they yanked Torrey back, and he fell, you know, into the mud.
That had never been done before. Nothing like that had ever been done in a Western. That in-your-face result of violence had never been shown.
He had come back from the war, and you know, he'd seen men killed and shot and fall, and he'd seen what a .45 does to the human form.
Like many Hollywood filmmakers, George Stevens was involved in active service during the Second World War, even helping to liberate Dachau concentration camp. His experiences revolutionized the way that he filmed violence, bringing a greater degree of realism to the confrontations in Shane.
All of that was, you know, a tremendous change of life for a young man who'd grown up in San Francisco and been the cameraman for Laurel and Hardy and become a movie director. And suddenly for 3.5 years, day by day, you're a military man. And he came back and hadn't seen a movie in 3 or 4 years, and he started seeing Westerns, and people would shoot and fall forward and get up and start shooting some more. And I think one idea he had was to really demonstrate the power of a single bullet on a human being.
In the final confrontation between Alan Ladd, he sees a man up on the balcony and ducks and shoots, and the man teeters and falls through a guardrail and a table and onto the floor, exactly like a poleaxe steer. Just dead meat.
Shane, look out!
These are not sequences Stevens would have shot in 1939. These are not sequences Stevens would have thought of shooting, because he hadn't seen what death really is and how final death really is. And that experience of World War II, I believe, radicalized him. And by inserting that realistic violence into Shane, he essentially inserted the leading edge of reality into the Western genre.
Shane's exploration of violence was to have great influence on the Western as a whole, but it was particularly revered in Japan. Here, Westerns were incredibly popular and influential upon the samurai movies of directors such as Akira Kurosawa.
It's a very interesting story, the relationship between Kurosawa and the Western, because when Kurosawa made The Seven Samurai in the 1950s, it was his homage to the films of John Ford and George Stevens' film Shane, which was incredibly popular in Japan.
Kurosawa, along with everybody else, saw a lot of Westerns. And every time he had a chance, when people would ask him who his favorite director was, he would always say John Ford.
When he returned from Europe, he called me and said, "Come over quick, I'll show you my treasure." It was a big photograph of John Ford. He wore sunglasses and this hunting cap. Kurosawa pointed to the picture and kept on saying, "Don't you think it's great?" He was as happy as a kid that Ford had even signed the photograph to my dear Akira Kurosawa. So Kurosawa tells me that apparently there is a shop that made these hunting caps, and could I go track it down for him? And I did. From that time, he started wearing these hunting caps and sunglasses. That is complete imitation of John Ford. And I was the one who tracked down the cap for him.
Well, he always said that he was influenced by Ford and the form, I guess, of the Western. But the interesting thing was the samurai. I mean, he brought the samurai into existence in the world of cinema.
The Seven Samurai is the most famous of the samurai films of Kurosawa. Here, the lone gunfighter of the Western is transformed into 7 samurai warriors. He was influenced by John Ford, but worked on an epic scale, with the 7 samurai defending a village against a gang of bandits. Kurosawa was to radically influence American directors, with a number of his films being adapted into westerns.
We have a whole genre of American films which are based on Kurosawa films. The Magnificent Seven might be the most successful, mainly because the myth is the most strongest myth. You got these 7 guys who are going out for a good deed, and they got screwed.
In the Hollywood version of The Magnificent Seven, the guys just kept blasting away at their guns, just like Yakuza. I was deeply disappointed, and I could see Kurosawa drooping his head and muttering, "This is not right, this is not right, it's completely different from my film." However, he did say, "I suppose that works as a piece of entertainment."
I met Kurosawa in Japan a couple of times, and I asked him, I said, well, I asked him, what did you think of The Magnificent Seven? He said, I wish my film would have made as much money as yours did.
The post-war Western had begun to run out of steam by 1960, as stars such as John Wayne and James Stewart were becoming outmoded. When the director John Sturges adapted Kurosawa's The 7 Samurai into The Magnificent Seven, he produced 2 innovations that revitalized the genre. Firstly, he set the story in Mexico rather than the Midwest of the classic Western. Secondly, he introduced a gang of young, relatively unknown actors into the genre.
It was rejuvenating, trying to rejuvenate the Western by grooming, you know, some new stars who could perhaps take over from the Waynes and the Stewarts and the Randolph Scotts.
When Sturges was casting this thing, I came to see him, and he said, yeah, Jim, you got the big thick glasses on. Yeah, Jim, okay, yeah, you're in the movie. I don't know where you're going to be yet. This one of the 7. I said, what part is that? Is that Britt, the man with the knife? And he says, yeah, that's the one. I said, that's the one I want to play, man. And he said, wow. Oh, well, let's see. I'll give you a ring around a lot, you know. And he called me up, 3 o'clock. Said, come over, pick up your knives.
I think I ran into Jimmy Coburn or something. I said, you know, they're casting over here for The Magnificent Seven. And Jimmy was an old friend of mine. We went to college together in the early 50s in Los Angeles City College. And, of course, Jim went in, and he got it. And I think he had, I don't know, 9 words or something in the picture. But everybody remembers him vividly from the picture. And really was a huge start for his career.
The character was based on that single-minded directness. The knife, the great blade.
Each of them has a particular contribution to make to the team effort. You know, it's like making a movie, actually. And that was an unusual thing in the Western. You know, instead of an all-seeing, all-powerful hero, there are little bits of hero, and you put them all together and you get the Magnificent Seven. They fought like 700. And Eli Wallach as a wonderful, wonderful Mexican baddie.
Generosity. That was my first mistake. I leave these people a little bit extra, and they hire these men to make trouble.
Calvera was the name of my character. You understood his plight. He said, I have men to feed, I have responsibilities, and this is one way I do it. I go from village to village to village in order to take care of my men.
I'm going into the hills for the winter. Where am I going to get the food for my men? Buy it or grow it. Or maybe even work for it. 7. Somehow I don't think you've solved my problem.
It has this theme of the powerless peons in Mexico, robber bandits sort of destroying their livelihood at every harvest time, and they can't quite look after themselves. They need help.
We kind of take on a moral stance here of helping these poor people out with our craft, our ability to kill. And if we kill somebody better than we are, then we're okay.
They come together to do the right thing. Why do they do this? They're not sure. They even talk about, why are we doing this? Why are we risking our lives for these Mexican peasants?
Eli Wallach says, you came back. Why? It's a very good question. Because they're coming back because in the end they're noble American gunfighters. They're not mercenaries after all. That's what marks it out as an American Western.
You came back for a place like this. Why? A man like you. Why?
When we were filming, we thought this is going to be a real bummer. We have no script. We've got a Japanese story that doesn't necessarily appeal to Americans, we thought, and we've got a Mongolian guy from Brooklyn playing American cowboy named Yul Brynner. We said this is going to be really bad. And I now understand. I was told that after Casablanca, it's the most oft-played American film on American television. Casablanca is first.
I think The Magnificent Seven is the crucible of all 60s American Westerns, apart from the Italian influence, you know, that Peckinpah's in there. Even what John Wayne was going to do in the late 60s is in there when he went off to Durango and did all these Mexican things. So it's a very, very influential film, and in Europe particularly.
It was a big hit, The Magnificent Seven. It plays every other month in America. But I loved it. The music, people whistle the music when I walk by now sometimes.
While Kurosawa was inspiring developments in the American Western, his film Yojimbo was also the source for the first internationally successful Italian Western, A Fistful of Dollars, in 1964. Its director, Sergio Leone, reinvented the whole genre, creating the so-called spaghetti Western.
In the arts, everything is interchangeable. And it's quite nice to take from one culture to another. When I made one for Leone, he'd been sued by the Japanese. He had taken a film called Yojimbo and did it frame by frame by frame from the Japanese. Only made it an American Western with Clint Eastwood.
That was hilarious. Kurosawa and I saw it together. The thing is, they made that without any permission. They just went ahead and made the movie. I remember him being astonished and saying, "Gosh, this is so much like my Yojimbo. This is so similar. Wow, this is so much alike," until the movie ended.
A Fistful of Dollars is Yojimbo done over again, right down to shot sequences identical. So identical that Toho sued the Fistful of Dollars people and won for plagiarism.
Leone grew up as a young boy in Italy, watching the American Westerns. And that's all, he really wanted to do that. He apprenticed for a while with Federico Fellini, who was on the set and worked with him. And he thought, I will bring an approach to it, to the West, a little different from the American. I'll bring the Italian flavor.
It's just his whole world that he created. There's something really, really special about, and there's only been a few filmmakers to do it, to go into like an old genre, all right, as old as you can possibly get, and to really create something that had never been before, all right, which is what he did with the spaghetti Westerns.
When I first saw him, the agent said, he wants you to do an Italian Western. I said, what's it? He said, it's a spaghetti Western. I said, that's like Hawaiian pizza. I don't know, how do you do that? He said, I met Leone, he said, would you like to see just the credits of my first movie? And I went to a little studio and he showed me. And his name came up on the credits and a gun shot off and knocked each letter of his name down. I said, where do you want me to go? He said, I want you in Rome on such and such a day. And I went.
Leone didn't want too much talk in the Western. Cynics might say that's because the films were dubbed into different languages and there are about 10 different nationalities on the set. But I genuinely think he wanted to bring back action, directness, physical activity in movies, and not too much psychoanalyzing people's motives.
There's really no characters. They're kind of sardonic, ironic, killing machines.
He also created one of, the greatest screen icons in the history of cinema, in the term of Clint Eastwood. He actually is the only director to really, compete with Ford when it came to, creating his own icon. He created the actor to finally replace John Wayne.
What do you mean?
I mean, our partnership is untied. Oh, no.
Wait.
Not you. You remain tied. I'll keep the money and you can have the role.
I think Eastwood is the origin of the modern cinematic hero. I'm afraid, I hate to lay this at Leone's door, but, the Schwarzeneggers, the Bruce Willises, the Charles Bronsons, all those, the Van Dammes, all those style heroes that emerged afterwards begin with Clint Eastwood in Fistful of Dollars. It's Italian machismo meets American style.
He, more or less kind of created even the spillover of the spaghetti westerns into just American westerns with the bad good guy or the anti-hero and the levels of violence and the ambiguity as far as the good guy and the bad guy was concerned. All that was then later adopted by the American westerns, and that was my time of consciousness.
The Italian westerns made this huge effort to sort of give a shot in the arm to the Western, to give it more energy, to make people believe in it again, and to resemble those movies that they all saw when they were children under Mussolini, when it was sort of forbidden pleasures to go and see the Western. So they rejuvenate it, but in the process they kill it off because they pump it up, they exaggerate it, they have an action climax every 10 minutes, they have lots of emphasis on hardware, lots of brutality, lots of noise, and you reach a sort of point of no return almost with that.
The most influential of Leone's films with Eastwood was The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, also starring Lee Van Cleef and Eli Wallach. Here, Leone's stylistic innovations were taken to an extreme, aided by Ennio Morricone's extraordinary score.
Leone's visual sense was so extravagantly beautiful. It really was comparable to Ford's in almost every respect. Even more expansive and even more languid, and Ford didn't have Ennio Morricone. And a great composer in a predominantly visual medium, like the Western, which is not dialogue intensive for the most part, is very important.
Leone always ended his films, the Westerns, either in a circle with a shootout, or music playing, or a clock. All those things were his imprint.
He also takes that grammar of sort of walking towards each other, long shot, medium shot, shot of face, shot of eyes, and takes that grammar and extends it into a mad kind of rhetoric, so that each shot lasts twice as long as it ever has before, and he's sort of celebrating in a really extreme way that increasing sort of tension. So long shot, hands, medium shot, face, close up, close up, close up, and real close up with the Technicolor screen. So Techniscope screen. So you've got Clint Eastwood's eyes, Eli Wallach's eyes, Lee Van Cleef, and you can tell a lot from their eyes because you can read their character. And he's taking the grammar of the Western and just pumping it up and exaggerating.
Oh.
To me, one of the most wildly in particularly crushing weird things in the history of cinema is after going through this incredible journey in The Good and the Bad and the Ugly, where we've fallen in love with Eastwood and we've fallen in love with Wallach, and we just have to assume that they've committed some bond with each other, that they would still screw each other over at the end. You actually think that he might just hang Tuco at the end of the movie, and it's so crushing. Can't you guys feel towards each other the way we feel towards you? And where in movie would you do a 3-hour epic where there really is no bond by these guys, no matter what they've gone through at the end? There's a beauty in that.
Leone's iconoclastic take on the Western was a hit with the rebellious 60s generation. By the end of the decade, the Vietnam War had started, and the old heroes were seen as suspect. Instead, Western leads became anti-heroes, like the bank-robbing outlaws in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
Well, I was reading stuff in the late 50s, and I came across their story, which was unknown at that time, There was very little written about them at that time. But what appealed to me was the two men becoming legends again. Scott Fitzgerald, one of our great writers, said there are no second acts in American lives. And what appealed to me was that they went to South America, they were driven out, and they did it again, and they lived down there for all those years until they died.
I know that I read the script on my way to London and called the agent who was my agent and said, "You got to get this for me." And the agent, a very wonderful guy named Everett Ziegler, said, "Well, there's a lot of other bidding for this." I said, "Get it, or else, or else." And at that time, I was able to exercise a certain amount of pressure. And we got it.
I think the element of humor that ran throughout that movie plays a big part as to why people like these guys. They were very charming. They were kind of scoundrels. It was sort of a Robin Hood sort of thing in a way. Not that they were giving the money to the poor, but they were fighting against the railroad, a big entity that was cold-hearted, and these guys had loads of heart.
They got in trouble. They robbed a lot of trains and banks, and E.H. Harriman, who ran the Union Pacific Railroad, formed a super posse, and something never done before, to kill them. I had no idea if I was writing a traditional or non-traditional or a hip or a buddy or any kind of Western. I was trying to tell the story of these two guys who died without knowing each other's names. At least that was my concept of them. And I just wrote it hoping the story would hold. There are times when the movie gets very frail. The super posse saves me twice. The first time they appear, they're doing fun and games and raindrops and all that stuff, and then it gets dicey.
Damn it!
I suppose what really makes the movie is the jump off the cliff. Because when that was new, people used to shout and clap and scream and all that stuff.
All right. I'll jump first. Nope. Then you jump first. No, I said. What's the matter with you? I can't swim!
I stole that from the greatest movie ever made, which is Gunga Din, in which Cary Grant and Victor McLaglen and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. jump off a cliff. And I was thrilled and screamed when I was 8. Westerns tend to be based on confrontations. And at this point, it seems normal that they run away. I wrote the entire middle third of the movie is essentially a plot point saying, please go to South America. In other words, I had the super posse chase them and get closer and closer until they jump off the cliff and decide to go, because I didn't want people thinking they were cowards. I wanted them to be happy they were getting out. So, and then the end of it, a lot of it's real. We don't know how they died. I think that's how they died. But a lot of it's pretty much what the Cassidy story was.
We have these two beloved characters, and there they are. They're sitting down, eating a meal, possibly of iguana or chicken. And as they start eating, we begin to see the scene fill up, the soldiers in place. And then it all exploded.
The specialty of the house, and it's still moving.
I had the notion that if I could get to the ending, it would be terrific if they never talked about their situation. If they talked about Australia and beaches and what they'd done and blah, 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 that was swell. As long as I stayed away from the fact that they were going, that was my moment of stupid courage that I wrote at the end of the movie. They never talk about where they are.
Got horses in Australia. Hell, they got thousands of miles we could hide out in. A good climate, nice beaches. You could learn to swim.
No, swimming isn't important.
You never know anything when you're writing. You never know if you're going to write the next day or if you're going to quit or if it's going to be terrific or awful. But I knew if I could get to that scene, if I could somehow make my story get there, I knew that I would be able to write that scene. And the last shot, which became a famous shot where it freezes and then it bleeds out, that was a very tricky shot in those days. But I think essentially, for whatever reason, audiences took to those two guys. There was a whole mythology at the time, because people were always trying to figure out, why is a hit a hit? because of the Vietnam War then, and the Vietnam War was, the super posse was Vietnam coming to kill all the good young people. I don't know why it was a hit. People liked it. The only reason movies are successes is because people like them, and the only reason they're failures is people don't like them, and everything else is mythology.
I remember seeing at that time some scripts depicting the end of the Old West. And cowboys getting in their automobiles, or ranchers getting in their automobiles, or primitive automobiles, and so on.
The late 60s and 70s saw a flurry of revisionist westerns, such as A Man Called Horse and Soldier Blue, that critically examined the myths of the West, especially the treatment of the Indians. But one director truly made the end of the West his subject, Sam Peckinpah. In films such as The Wild Bunch and Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, he explored what happened to the figures of the Old West as their way of life was drawing to a close.
Peckinpah consciously doesn't set his movies in 1875 or 1888, where John Ford was setting his movies. Peckinpah is setting his movies around 1900, you know, with the advent of the motor car.
With the car came the death of the West, and that was what fascinated him the most, was that transition from the West, the frontier world, to the modern generation, to the 20th century, to technology, to the car, to the aeroplane. And I think he yearned for the old and didn't like the new.
I think he was trying, and always did try, for the honest West. The honesty behind the people who lived in the West.
That was the magic, I think, of Sam Peckinpah, was able to use that milieu in the Western setting and make it so believable as a development of a creative idea, a creative vision, really, what he had of the West, because I found out he was raised in the northern part of California, and knew a lot about the West, and knew what he was talking about, and was trying to capture in film.
The Western had always been more or less an inherently optimistic genre, in that the characters went on. In Stagecoach, Ringo and Dallas take the buckboard and go to his spread across the border where the law can't get them. They're going to have a life. They're going to raise a family on his land. Even Shane's wounded, but he's going over the hill. He may live, he may die. We don't know. But he's moving on, you know. Moving on is the key part of the Western myth. And that's also a key part of the American myth, that you can, if things don't work out one place, they may work out another, and you can reinvent yourself. You can become whatever you want yourself to be. That's a very American idea. Peckinpah, everybody dies and the vultures arrive to pick the bones.
After Peckinpah, the Western sunk into decline during the 70s and 80s. However, Clint Eastwood continued to both direct and star in Westerns, and in 1992, he released an extraordinary revisionist Western, Unforgiven. Eastwood's character is a former gunfighter who is recruited to track down two men who have disfigured a prostitute. Unlike his role in the Leone films, here he is an aging, unheroic figure, and the film is a powerful examination of the consequences of violence.
After he came back to America, having made The Good, the Bad, the Ugly in 1967, Eastwood spent a long, long time trying to find an American idiom to use the character of the man with no name in American movies. And it's a fascinating, I mean, you know, Fistful of Dollars, Josie Wales Outlaw, Unforgiven is a fascinating riff on this character, this self-sufficient, stylish, rather self-contained character, and then turning him into a human being. And frankly, by the time of Unforgiven, Eastwood was the Western. An entire genre rested on that man's shoulders.
He didn't really have a character in Sergio Leone. They call him the man with no name. In Unforgiven, he does have a character. He's a widower. He's got a couple kids. He's a farmer who can't make a go of it. He used to be a killer. He used to be a gunfighter, and that was how he made his money. And he tried to go clean because of his wife.
The Schofield kid comes in and says to Clint's character, this is what happened with these women. You know, I'm this, you know, tough killer myself. I've heard you're a pretty good killer too. Come help me take care of this situation, you know, resolution. Let's resolve this.
The whole plot is triggered by a girl being cut up. And no, that's something you don't do. I'm going to ride halfway across America to put that right. It has a black character, Morgan Freeman, who doesn't hang around for the final shootout, and there's a very interesting relationship between him and the man with no name. They're very at ease with each other. And the violence, the Schofield kid, this young punk, this wimp who thinks he's going to be terribly macho, and in the end absolutely hates shooting people, and it's messy and horrible and so on.
It's a hell of a thing, killing a man. You take away all he's got and all he's ever gonna have.
Yeah. Well, I guess they had it coming.
We all have it coming, kid.
It's such an anti-heroic piece. The people who you think are heroes are not. People you think aren't have heroic qualities that you don't expect in them. They're more like human beings. There's shades of gray. There's no black and white in it.
At the end of the film, Eastwood's character, William Money, kills 6 people in revenge for the death of his friend Ned. His massacre is witnessed by W. Beauchamp, a writer who's mythologized the West and turned its gunfighters into heroes.
He's a character who kind of represents all the bullshit about Westerns and about the mythology of these outlaws and so-called heroic outlaws, who are many of them psychopaths and violent thugs.
The writer of sort of penny dreadfuls and dime novels in the Western has quite a long genealogy, actually. I mean, he's there in The Left-Handed Gun in the 50s, written by Gore Vidal. He's there in Buffalo Bill and the Indians, made by Robert Altman for bicentennial year. You know, the myth maker, Ned Buntline, is wandering around constantly exaggerating what Buffalo Bill's been up to. Give the public what they want. It's the show business. And he's there in Unforgiven. He usually appears in films where it's a sort of signal that this is going to be a meditation on the creation of myths.
This is a guy who made his living, you know, mythologizing the West without knowing anything about it. And so, in a way, it served the purpose really well of a script that was doing exactly that for the Western.
When confronted by superior numbers, an experienced gunfighter will always fire on the best shot first.
Is that so?
Yeah, Little Bill told me that. You probably killed him first, didn't you?
I was lucky in the order. But I've always been lucky when it comes to killing folks.
And so, who was next? It was Clyde, right? He must have killed Clyde. Well, could have been Deputy Andy, wasn't he?
All I can tell you is who's going to be last.
Where does William Money go? He's damned. He's damned himself. He's crossed over into darkness. There's no possible way out for him.
And he just walks out of that saloon, and it's dark and it's raining and nobody contests him. Is he, you know, riding off into the sunset? No, he's riding off into the cold, wet darkness.
He rides into hell. And I think that's what is so wonderful about it. There's nothing great about what he's done. It's awful what he's doing.
What you get in films of the 60s and 70s with movies like The Wild Bunch, or later on Unforgiven, which end in Götterdämmerungs of blood and death, where there's nobody left and no possibility left of redemption, you get a dead end, which is one of the reasons that the Western is essentially a dead genre. In an effort to bring something new to the mix, they nailed the coffin lid shut in the genre.
When I was a kid, I started going to movies in the 30s, if you will. And two of the great genres that were the basis, like special effects movies are and violence movies are, were Westerns and musicals, and now they're both gone.
It's a foundation myth of American society. It can't go. There's never been a body of myth that disappears. It'll reform itself in some way. Well, you could say it's reformed itself as Star Wars, that the Western lives in the zero gravity of space, you know? Or it reforms itself as cop movies, post-Dirty Harry. So it still lives in other genres, although it's lost its iconography and its setting and its historical take.
I mean, the only Western of quality in the last decade has been Eastwood's wonderful Unforgiven.
You can't say Unforgiven is the culmination of all Westerns. I mean, it was, you know, a very good Western of all Westerns anyways, and it had happened to be done most recently.
I hear that people are considering the Western again, just as they're turning to film noir again.
Maybe the Western will come back. It's a great, you know, it's a pure American art form.